What should have been a perfect family outing turned into a scene no one could have predicted. Imagine standing in a zoo, surrounded by the sound of laughter and the chatter of curious children, when suddenly a young boy is shoved into the lion's enclosure. Gasps echo through the crowd, parents clutch their children, and time seems to freeze as a predator, majestic yet deadly, rises to its feet. Would the lion attack? Would the boy survive? And most shocking of all, the person who pushed him wasn't a stranger. It was a zoo employee. This story isn't just about fear or survival. It's about bravery, injustice, and an outcome so extraordinary it left everyone speechless. Before we dive into this gripping tale of courage, redemption, and change, comment below where you're watching from today. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss more incredible stories like this one. On a bright and hopeful morning, the Williams family was preparing for a day they had been anticipating for months. David, a loving father with a quiet determination, had promised his son Marcus a trip to the zoo, and today he was finally making good on that promise. For David, this was more than just a family outing. It was the fulfillment of a long-held dream he had carried since his childhood. As Marcus excitedly zipped up his small backpack, filled with essentials like his favorite animal-themed storybook and a bottle of water, David found himself reflecting on his own upbringing. Trips to places like the zoo had been out of reach for his family back then. His parents had worked tirelessly to provide for their household, but luxuries like a day at the zoo had always been beyond their means. Now, as a father himself, David had vowed to give his son the experiences he never had. A vow rooted in love and the unshakable bond of family. The morning sunlight poured through the windows of their modest but warm home, casting a golden glow over the bustling preparations. Sarah, David's wife and Marcus's devoted mother, stood in the kitchen packing snacks, her eyes soft and affectionate as she watched Marcus bounce around the room. The young boy's excitement was contagious, his endless stream of questions about lions, giraffes, and elephants filling the air like music. Bookmark go back. "Do you think the lions will be as big as in my book, Daddy?" Marcus asked, holding up the worn pages of his beloved storybook. David chuckled, ruffling his son's curly hair. "Bigger, Marcus. Much bigger. But don't worry, they'll be behind a strong glass wall. You'll be safe." Sarah exchanged a knowing glance with David, her smile faltering for just a moment. They both understood the unspoken tension that often accompanied their outings as a black family. Whether it was lingering stares at the grocery store or strangers making assumptions about them, prejudice had a way of casting shadows on even the brightest days. But today, David was determined to focus on the joy of the moment. He wasn't about to let the world's biases dampen Marcus's excitement or tarnish the memory they were about to create. "Let's go," Marcus exclaimed, grabbing his backpack and racing toward the door. David and Sarah followed, laughing at their son's enthusiasm. As they locked up their home and climbed into the car, David took a deep breath, silently reassuring himself. Today would be perfect. The drive to the zoo was a cheerful one, with Marcus's non-stop chatter filling the air. He peppered his parents with questions, from, "Do lions really roar as loud as they do in the movies?" to "Do zebras ever get confused by their stripes?" David and Sarah answered as best they could, their hearts full as they watched their son's curiosity come alive. For Marcus, this was more than just a trip. It was the beginning of an adventure, a day to marvel at the wonders of the natural world. As they arrived at the zoo, the energy of the place immediately swept them up. Families with children in tow crowded the entrance, the air buzzing with laughter, and the occasional squawk of a parrot from inside the gates. Brightly colored banners fluttered in the breeze, advertising the zoo's many attractions. Meet the lions, explore the rainforest, and dive into the aquarium. Marcus was practically vibrating with excitement as David purchased their tickets. He craned his neck to catch glimpses of animals from the entrance, his eyes wide with wonder. But as David handed over the tickets, something or someone caught his attention. A man in a green uniform stood near the entrance, his arms crossed and his expression unusually stern. His name tag read Robert, but his demeanor was anything but friendly. David noticed the way Robert's gaze lingered on his family, a cold, assessing look that sent a chill down his spine. David wasn't new to these moments, the silent judgments and quiet hostility that spoke volumes without a word being said. He was used to brushing it off, focusing instead on the things that truly mattered: his wife, his son, and the memories they were creating. Still, there was something about Robert's stare that unsettled him. Shrugging it off, David turned his attention back to Marcus, who was tugging on his sleeve. "Come on, Dad. I want to see the lions first." "Not so fast, buddy," David said, laughing. "We've got all day. Let's take our time and see everything, okay?" With that, the Williams family stepped through the gates, ready to embrace the day ahead. But as they ventured deeper into the zoo, David couldn't quite shake the feeling that Robert's eyes were still on them. The first steps inside the zoo were magical. Marcus darted ahead, his small feet carrying him toward the towering signs that pointed the way to various exhibits. The morning sun glinted off the colorful displays, and the sounds of exotic birds chirping echoed in the distance. It was the kind of day David had always envisioned, a day of discovery and wonder, filled with laughter and shared moments with his family. "Where do we go first?" Marcus asked, his eyes scanning the map clutched in his little hands. He looked up at David and Sarah, his face glowing with anticipation. "Well, how about the aviary?" Sarah suggested, pointing toward a path shaded by tall trees. "We'll get to the lions, but let's pace ourselves. There's so much to see." Marcus hesitated for a moment, clearly torn, but then he nodded. "Okay, but only if we don't skip the lions," David chuckled. "Don't worry, kiddo. We won't miss a thing." The aviary was a feast for the senses. A wide netted dome stretched high above them, filled with tropical plants and vibrant birds that flitted from branch to branch. The air was alive with color and sound. Marcus's laughter rang out as a bright green parrot swooped down, perching on a nearby railing to eye him curiously. "Look at that one, Dad," Marcus exclaimed, pointing to a bird with brilliant blue feathers. "Do you think it can talk?" "Maybe," David replied, crouching down beside him. "Why don't you say hi and see if it answers?" "Hi," Marcus said brightly, leaning closer to the bird. The parrot tilted its head, squawked loudly, and then flapped its wings. Marcus erupted into giggles, clapping his hands in delight. Sarah captured the moment on her phone, her heart swelling as she watched her son's joy. But as David stood and glanced around, the unease he had felt earlier crept back in. At the edge of the aviary, standing just outside the entrance, was Robert. He wasn't doing anything. He was just standing there, his arms crossed and his gaze fixed firmly on the Williams family. David frowned. The man's presence was unnerving, and his expression carried an unspoken hostility that David couldn't ignore. "Is something wrong?" Sarah asked quietly, noticing the tension in David's face. David shook his head, forcing a smile. "No, nothing. Just keeping an eye on Marcus." Sarah didn't push further, though the concern lingered in her eyes. She had seen the same man watching them when they first arrived, and now here he was again. "Let's keep moving," David said, gently steering Marcus toward the next exhibit. The reptile house was their next stop, a dimly lit building filled with glass enclosures housing snakes, lizards, and other cold-blooded creatures. Marcus pressed his nose against the glass of one tank, marveling at a massive python coiled under a heat lamp. "Whoa, it's huge," he whispered, his voice full of awe. David chuckled. "That one could probably eat a whole watermelon in one bite. Or maybe a bad guy," Marcus added, grinning. Sarah laughed, shaking her head. "Let's not give him any ideas, Marcus. I think he's happy enough with his heat lamp." For a brief moment, David felt the tension in his chest ease. Watching Marcus's fascination and hearing Sarah's laughter reminded him of why they were here. This day wasn't about the stares or the judgments they might face. It was about creating memories that Marcus would carry with him for the rest of his life. But as they left the reptile house and stepped back into the sunlight, David spotted Robert again. This time, the man was leaning against a nearby tree, his gaze following them as they moved down the path. David's jaw tightened. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the way Robert was trailing them felt deliberate. "Do you see him?" Sarah whispered, her voice low. David nodded. "Yeah, I see him. Let's just keep going." The family decided to take a short break at a nearby picnic area, where families were gathered around tables enjoying snacks and drinks. Marcus munched on a sandwich, chattering happily about the animals he'd seen so far. I can't wait to see the lions, he said between bites. Do you think they're awake yet? They might be, Sarah said, smoothing his hair. We'll head there next, okay? As Marcus finished his snack and hopped off the bench, David glanced around the area. His eyes landed on Robert once more, standing on the far side of the clearing. The man wasn't even trying to hide his presence now. His arms were still crossed, and his face was set in a hard, almost challenging expression. David clenched his fists, his frustration mounting. He had spent his entire life navigating moments like this, silent standoffs with people who felt entitled to judge him or his family. But this felt different. There was something more pointed about Robert's behavior, something that made David's protective instincts flare. Let's go, David said, standing and taking Marcus's hand. Sarah looked at him questioningly, but didn't argue. They left the picnic area, heading toward the lion enclosure. David stayed close to Marcus, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of Robert. As they approached the lion exhibit, Marcus's excitement reached its peak. He ran ahead, pressing his hands against the tall glass wall that separated the visitors from the majestic predators inside. Look, Dad. There they are. Marcus exclaimed, his voice filled with wonder. David smiled, kneeling beside his son. A large male lion with a thick golden mane lay stretched out in the sun, its amber eyes scanning the enclosure. Do you think he's looking at me? Marcus asked in a hushed voice. Maybe, David said. Lions are very observant. They notice everything. For a moment, all was right in the world. Marcus was mesmerized by the lions, Sarah was snapping photos, and David felt a swell of pride watching his son admire the animals he loved so much. But then David glanced over his shoulder, and there was Robert, standing a few feet away. This time his expression wasn't just unfriendly, it was hostile. The man's dark eyes flicked between David and Marcus, his jaw set in a way that made David's stomach churn. Something was wrong. David's grip on Marcus's shoulder tightened. He didn't know what Robert's problem was, but his presence was casting a shadow over what should have been a perfect day. Let's move to another spot, David said quietly to Sarah, trying to keep his voice steady. As they walked away, David couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last time they would encounter Robert. The zoo was buzzing with life that day, every pathway bustling with visitors eager to explore. Families walked hand in hand, children ran ahead in excitement, and the faint roars, chirps, and squawks of animals created a lively symphony in the background. The Williams family tried to immerse themselves in the joy of the outing, pushing aside the tension that Robert's presence had cast over their morning. David focused on Marcus, who was busy pointing at the colorful banners and naming each animal he recognized. His small finger shot toward one in particular. Dad, look. The lion's banner is so cool, it's like he's the king of the zoo. David chuckled, ruffling his son's curls. That's because he is. Lions are called the kings of the jungle for a reason, buddy. They're strong, powerful, and brave. Marcus's eyes widened, like superheroes? Exactly, David replied, though his smile faltered as they rounded a corner and saw a familiar figure standing near the next exhibit. Robert was there again, leaning against a railing with that same unsettling gaze. He wasn't just lingering anymore, it felt deliberate and pointed. David clenched his jaw but resisted the urge to confront him. This was Marcus's day, and nothing, not even Robert, would ruin it. Marcus, why don't we head to the rainforest section next? Sarah suggested, her voice calm despite the tension she felt. Can we see monkeys there? Marcus asked, already bouncing on his toes. You bet, Sarah said with a smile, taking his hand and leading him toward the shaded walkway that led to the rainforest exhibit. David lingered a step behind, his eyes briefly meeting Robert's before he turned away. The hostility in the man's expression was unmistakable, but David refused to let it dictate their day. The rainforest exhibit was a breathtaking space, alive with the sights and sounds of a tropical paradise. Lush greenery stretched high above them, creating a canopy that dappled the ground with soft sunlight. Vibrant parrots and toucans perched on branches, their calls filling the air, while waterfalls cascaded into crystal-clear pools. Marcus was in awe. Look at that bird, Dad, he exclaimed, pointing to a toucan with a strikingly colorful beak. Do you think he eats fruit all the time? Mostly fruit, David replied, crouching down beside him. But they might snack on bugs too if they're feeling adventurous. Marcus scrunched up his nose. Gross! Sarah laughed, capturing the moment on her phone. Adventurous like you, huh? Not me, Marcus replied quickly. I don't eat bugs. For a while, the unease faded, replaced by the simple joy of exploring a world unlike their own. Marcus giggled as a parrot squawked overhead, mimicking its sound with enthusiasm. Sarah and David exchanged a smile, feeling a momentary reprieve from the tension that had followed them earlier. But as they moved deeper into the exhibit, David's eyes instinctively scanned the area. He spotted Robert again, standing near the entrance to the next section. The man's presence felt heavier now, his gaze unrelenting as he watched the Williams family move through the exhibit. David's fists clenched at his sides. He didn't want to alarm Marcus, but his patience was wearing thin. This wasn't just casual observation anymore. This felt targeted. The next stop was the African Savannah exhibit, a sprawling area designed to mimic the vast plains of Africa. Zebras grazed lazily in the distance, their black and white stripes gleaming in the sun, while giraffes stretched their long necks to nibble on leaves from towering trees. Wow! Marcus gasped, his small face lighting up with excitement. They're so tall. Imagine how high they could reach if they stood on their tiptoes. Sarah teased, making Marcus laugh. David tried to focus on the moment, on the sound of his son's laughter and the beauty of the animals around them. But he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He turned his head slightly, scanning the crowd, and sure enough, Robert was there again, standing at the edge of the Savannah exhibit. This time, David didn't look away. He locked eyes with Robert, his expression firm and unyielding. If the man wanted to intimidate him, it wasn't going to work. David, Sarah said softly, placing a hand on his arm. Don't let him get to you. Let's just keep moving. David exhaled slowly, nodding. You're right, let's go. As they continued through the zoo, Marcus's enthusiasm never waned. He marveled at the playful antics of the monkeys, squealed in delight at the shimmering fish in the aquarium, and even declared the sleepy owls in the nocturnal exhibit to be the cutest things ever. Everywhere they went, Sarah and David tried to soak in their son's joy, pushing aside the unease that Robert's presence had caused. But deep down, David couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. The final stop on their list was the lion enclosure, the exhibit Marcus had been looking forward to most. The anticipation in the air was palpable as they approached the tall glass walls that provided a clear view of the majestic creatures inside. There they are, Marcus shouted, racing ahead to press his hands against the glass. Inside the enclosure, a group of lions lounged in the midday sun, their golden fur glowing in the light. One of them, a large male with a thick, regal mane, lifted his head to survey the crowd. His amber eyes seemed to pierce through the barrier, and for a moment it felt as though he was looking directly at Marcus. "Dad, he's looking at me," Marcus said in awe, his face inches from the glass. David knelt beside him, a proud smile spreading across his face. "That's because you're brave, Marcus. Lions can sense that." But as David looked around, his smile faded. Robert was standing nearby again, his expression darker than ever. There was something in his eyes, something dangerous that made David's heart race. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice tight, "we need to go. Now." Before Sarah could respond, the unthinkable happened. The lion enclosure was alive with the excited chatter of children and families, the sunlight glinting off the tall glass walls that separated the majestic predators from their captivated audience. Marcus's small hands were pressed against the glass, his wide eyes fixed on the pride of lions lounging just a few feet away. "Look at his mane, Dad," Marcus exclaimed, pointing at the large male lion resting near the shade of a rock. "It's so big. Do you think it's heavy?" David crouched beside his son, a smile tugging at his lips despite the unease tightening in his chest. "It might be. That's how the other lions know he's in charge. It's like a crown for the king." Marcus grinned, clearly enthralled by the scene in front of him. But for David, the moment was clouded by a growing sense of dread. He glanced over his shoulder, and sure enough, there was Robert again, standing just a few feet away. This time, the man's expression wasn't just unfriendly, it was outright hostile. His jaw was clenched, his eyes locked on Marcus with an intensity that made David's stomach twist. David stood, instinctively positioning himself between Marcus and Robert. Sarah, who had been taking photos, noticed the tension in her husband's posture and quickly joined his side. "David," she whispered, her voice laced with concern. "What's wrong?" "It's him," David said under his breath, nodding discreetly toward Robert. "He's been following us all day. I don't like it." Sarah's eyes flicked toward Robert, and she immediately understood. The man's presence had been unsettling from the start, but now it was undeniable. His behavior was deliberate, calculated. "Let's move on," Sarah suggested, keeping her voice steady. "We'll find a quieter spot." David nodded, taking Marcus's hand. "Come on, buddy. Let's go check out the zebras before we head home." "But Dad, the lions," Marcus protested, his gaze still fixed on the glass. "We'll come back another time," David said, his tone firmer than usual. "Let's go." Reluctantly, Marcus allowed himself to be guided away from the enclosure, his enthusiasm dampened by the abrupt change in plans. As they walked, David kept a tight hold on his son's hand, his senses on high alert. The family made their way toward the exit, weaving through the crowd in silence. Sarah tried to keep the conversation light, pointing out different animals on the map, but the tension in the air was palpable. David couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every few steps, he glanced over his shoulder, his heart pounding with each movement. Then it happened. As they passed through a particularly crowded area near the snack stands, David felt a sudden, forceful shove from behind. He stumbled, barely catching himself before he fell, but the movement was enough to loosen his grip on Marcus's hand. "Marcus!" he shouted, spinning around just in time to see the unthinkable. Robert was there, his face twisted with a cruel smirk as he shoved Marcus toward the edge of the lion enclosure. Time seemed to slow. David lunged forward, his arms outstretched, but it was too late. Marcus stumbled, his small frame teetering precariously before disappearing over the edge. "Marcus!" Sarah screamed, her voice piercing through the chaos. The crowd erupted in panic as people realized what had happened. Gasps, shouts, and cries filled the air, but David could only hear the pounding of his own heart as he raced toward the glass barrier. Inside the enclosure, Marcus landed hard on the dusty ground, the impact knocking the wind out of him. He lay there for a moment, stunned and disoriented, before slowly pushing himself up on trembling hands. Above him, the massive glass walls loomed, cutting him off from the safety of his parents and the bustling crowd. And just a few yards away, the lions stirred. The large male lifted his head first, his amber eyes narrowing as he focused on the small figure that had suddenly appeared in his domain. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his powerful muscles rippling beneath his golden coat. Marcus froze, his breath hitching in his throat. His mind raced, but his body refused to move. "Marcus, stay still," David's voice echoed from above, desperate and shaking. "Don't move, son. Stay still." The fear in his father's voice jolted Marcus out of his daze. He remembered what David had told him about lions, that they were strong, powerful, and observant. If he moved too quickly, the lion might see him as a threat. So he stayed as still as he could, his small body trembling as the lion took a slow, deliberate step toward him. Above the enclosure, David was frantic. He gripped the edge of the barrier, his knuckles white as he fought the urge to climb over and rush to his son. "Sarah, stay here," he said, his voice barely audible over the chaos. But Sarah wasn't listening. She was trying to climb the barrier herself, her face streaked with tears as she called Marcus's name. "Help is coming," a zookeeper shouted, racing toward the scene with a team of staff in tow. "Stay back. We'll get him out." David barely registered the words. His entire world had narrowed to the sight of his son, so small and vulnerable, surrounded by one of nature's most fearsome predators. Inside the enclosure, Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. The lion was close now, its massive paws making almost no sound as it stepped closer. Its gaze was unblinking, its movements slow and deliberate. But as Marcus looked into the lion's eyes, something strange happened. The fear that had gripped him so tightly began to ease, replaced by a sense of wonder. The lion's eyes, so sharp and predatory, held an unexpected softness, a curiosity that mirrored his own. Marcus remembered what his father had said earlier. Lions can sense bravery. Taking a deep breath, Marcus willed himself to stay calm. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. He had to be brave. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as Marcus stood frozen in the lion's enclosure, the world around him fading into the background. The crowd's panicked cries, his parents' desperate shouts, and even the zookeeper's frantic instructions became muffled. as if filtered through a thick fog. All that remained clear to him was the lion, the immense, powerful creature now only a few feet away. The lion's golden eyes bore into Marcus with an intensity that left him rooted to the spot. It moved closer, its steps slow and measured, each one bringing it nearer to the small, trembling figure before it. Bookmark, go back. Marcus, don't move. David's voice rang out from above, sharp and filled with desperation. Marcus clenched his fists, his small body trembling as he fought against every instinct screaming at him to run. He could feel the coarse ground beneath his hands, the warmth of the sun beating down on his back, and the overwhelming weight of the lion's presence pressing against him. He remembered his father's words about bravery, how being brave didn't mean you weren't afraid, but that you stood your ground even when fear threatened to take over. The lion stopped, lowering its massive head to study Marcus more closely. Its amber eyes softened slightly. Curiosity replaced sharpness of its predatory gaze. Above, the crowd was a mixture of chaos and silence. People stood frozen, unable to tear their eyes away from the scene below. Mothers clutched their children, fathers held their breath, and the zookeepers were shouting into their radios, urgently calling for backup. "Marcus, listen to me." David shouted again, his voice hoarse. "Just stay still. Don't run." Marcus wasn't sure how he managed it, but he forced himself to obey. He stayed as still as he could, his small frame trembling but unmoving. The lion's presence was overwhelming. It seemed to radiate power, and every movement was deliberate and graceful. But as Marcus gazed into the lion's eyes, he saw something he hadn't expected: understanding. The lion didn't appear angry or threatened. Instead, its eyes held a quiet curiosity, as if it were trying to make sense of the small human in its territory. Marcus felt a flicker of hope, a tiny ember that grew stronger with each passing second. Slowly, the lion took another step forward, its massive paw landing just inches from Marcus's hand. The crowd above gasped audibly, their fear palpable. David clutched the barrier tightly, his heart hammering in his chest. He couldn't take his eyes off Marcus, every fiber of his being urging him to jump into the enclosure. But he knew that any sudden movement could escalate the situation, putting Marcus in even greater danger. Beside him, Sarah was sobbing uncontrollably, her hands gripping David's arm as she whispered their son's name over and over again. "He's brave," David murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "He's brave like the lion." Inside the enclosure, Marcus took a shaky breath. His instincts told him to look away, but something deep inside urged him to hold the lion's gaze. He remembered the countless times he had told his parents that he wanted to be brave like a lion. Now, faced with the creature he admired most, he realized what real bravery felt like. The lion leaned closer, its nose just inches from Marcus's face. Marcus held his breath, his heart pounding so loudly he thought the lion might hear it. Then, something incredible happened. The lion tilted its head slightly as if assessing Marcus. Its massive body relaxed, and the tension in the air seemed to dissipate. Slowly, it extended its nose toward Marcus, sniffing the air around him. Marcus, emboldened by the lion's calm demeanor, did something no one could have expected. He reached out a trembling hand. Above, the crowd erupted in murmurs of disbelief and panic. David and Sarah shouted in unison, their voices filled with terror. "Marcus, no!" But Marcus wasn't listening. His hand moved of its own accord, bridging the tiny distance between him and the lion. The lion froze, its golden eyes fixed on Marcus's outstretched fingers. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. The entire world held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, to everyone's astonishment, the lion lowered its head and gently nuzzled Marcus's hand. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. The lion's rough tongue brushed against Marcus's fingers in a gesture so tender it defied belief. Marcus's fear melted away, replaced by a sense of wonder and connection he couldn't put into words. He smiled faintly, his small hand resting against the lion's fur. David's legs nearly gave out as relief flooded through him. He gripped the barrier tightly, tears streaming down his face as he watched his son interact with the massive predator. "He's okay," David whispered, his voice trembling. "He's okay." Beside him, Sarah collapsed into his arms, her sobs turning into a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Thank God," she murmured over and over again. The zookeepers finally arrived, moving with cautious precision as they prepared to retrieve Marcus. One of them, a calm and experienced handler named Ethan, spoke into a megaphone. "Stay calm, everyone," Ethan said, his voice steady but firm. "We're going to get the boy out safely. Please remain where you are." Inside the enclosure, Marcus remained still as the lion stepped back, its gaze lingering on him for a moment longer before it turned and retreated to the shade of a nearby rock. Ethan climbed down into the enclosure, his movements slow and deliberate. He approached Marcus carefully, speaking in soothing tones. "You're very brave, buddy," Ethan said, crouching down to Marcus's level. "I'm here to take you back to your mom and dad, okay?" Marcus nodded, his wide eyes still locked on the lion in the distance. Ethan gently lifted him into his arms, carrying him toward the ladder that led back to safety. As they ascended, the crowd erupted into cheers and applause, the tension finally breaking. David and Sarah rushed forward as soon as Marcus was back on solid ground, enveloping him in a tight embrace. "Marcus," Sarah sobbed, cradling her son's face in her hands. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, Mom," Marcus replied softly, his voice steady despite the ordeal he had just endured. "The lion wasn't scary. He knew I wasn't going to hurt him." David hugged him tightly, his voice choked with emotion. "You were so brave, Marcus. So brave." As the family clung to each other, David's gaze flicked toward the crowd, his eyes locked on Robert, who was standing at the edge of the gathering. For the first time that day, the smirk was gone from Robert's face. He looked pale, almost stunned, as if he couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. David felt a surge of anger rises within him, but he forced it down. There would be time for answers, time for justice. Right now, all that mattered was that Marcus was safe. The crowd was still buzzing with shock and relief as the Williams family stood by the edge of the lion enclosure, holding tightly onto each other. For David, it felt like the world had slowed down. The adrenaline coursing through his veins began to fade, leaving behind a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. Marcus was safe. That was all that mattered at this moment. "I wasn't scared, Dad," Marcus said softly, his voice muffled against David's chest. "The lion knew I wasn't going to hurt him." David knelt his hands firmly on Marcus's shoulders. His son's face was streaked with dust, and his small frame trembled slightly, but his eyes were steady. They held a kind of quiet bravery that made David's throat tighten with emotion. "You are amazing, Marcus," David said, his voice thick. "Braver than I could have ever imagined." Sarah knelt beside them, her tears still falling freely as she hugged Marcus again. "I thought I lost you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was so scared, Marcus." "I'm okay, Mom," Marcus reassured her, his small hand patting her arm. "The lion was nice. He didn't hurt me." The zookeeper who had rescued Marcus, Ethan, approached cautiously, his expression both professional and compassionate. "Mr. and Mrs. Williams," he said gently, his voice breaking through the moment. "We're going to escort you to the medical center to have Marcus checked out. It's just a precaution, but we want to make sure he's completely okay." David nodded, standing and scooping Marcus into his arms. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady, despite the anger simmering just beneath the surface. As they followed Ethan through the crowd, David's eyes searched for Robert. The man had been standing near the edge of the enclosure moments ago, but now he was gone. David's jaw clenched. The rage he had pushed down earlier was starting to bubble up again. Robert had put Marcus in danger. He had deliberately shoved his son into a deadly situation, and yet he had simply disappeared into the chaos, leaving the family to pick up the pieces. "Do you think they'll find him?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice trembling. "They will," David said firmly. "And when they do, he's going to answer for what he did." At the zoo's medical center, Marcus was examined by a team of staff who reassured the family that he was unharmed apart from a few minor scrapes. The boy's calm demeanor during the ordeal seemed to baffle everyone. Most kids would be in complete shock after something like this, one nurse said, glancing at Marcus as he sipped from a juice box. "He's incredibly resilient." David and Sarah exchanged a look. Marcus's bravery had been nothing short of extraordinary, but they both knew that the emotional toll of the day might not reveal itself right away. "Thank you for taking care of him," Sarah said softly. The nurse nodded and smiled kindly. "He's a remarkable little boy. You should be proud." "We are," David replied, his voice resolute. Once the medical staff cleared Marcus, the family was escorted to a quiet office away from the zoo's main pathways. There, the zoo's director, a middle-aged woman named Rebecca Grant, was waiting to speak with them. "Mr. and Mrs. Williams," she began, her expression a mixture of apology and concern. "I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry we are for what happened today. This is an unprecedented incident, and I want to assure you that we're taking it very seriously." David folded his arms, his gaze sharp. "You mean the fact that one of your employees shoved my son into a lion enclosure? That's not just an incident. That's attempted murder." Rebecca flinched but didn't argue. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Williams. We are conducting a full investigation into the actions of our employee, Robert. He has already been removed from the premises, and we're cooperating fully with the authorities." Sarah's voice trembled as she spoke. "How could someone like that even work here? How could you allow this to happen?" Rebecca sighed, her expression heavy with regret. "We've uncovered troubling details about Robert's past that suggest this wasn't an isolated act of hostility. It appears there were warning signs we failed to address, and for that, I take full responsibility. I promise you, changes will be made." David leaned forward, his voice cold. "Promises don't undo what happened to my son." Rebecca nodded. "You're absolutely right. That's why we're taking immediate steps to ensure the safety of our visitors and to hold everyone involved accountable. We will also provide your family with the support you need, including covering any medical expenses and offering counseling services for Marcus." David didn't respond right away. He studied Rebecca's face, searching for any sign of insincerity. Finally, he nodded curtly. "I appreciate that. But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." As the family left the zoo later that evening, the adrenaline that had kept them moving began to wear off. Marcus sat quietly in the back seat, his head resting against the window as he watched the city lights blur past. "Are you okay, buddy?" David asked, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. Marcus nodded slowly. "I'm tired," he admitted. Sarah turned in her seat to face him. "That's okay, sweetheart. We're almost home. You'll feel better after some rest." David tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his mind racing with thoughts of what needed to happen next. Filing a report with the police, consulting a lawyer, and demanding accountability from the zoo, he would do whatever it took to ensure that Robert faced justice. But for now, his focus was on Marcus. When they finally arrived home, David carried Marcus inside and gently tucked him into bed. The boy's eyes fluttered shut almost immediately, his small body relaxing as sleep claimed him. David sat beside him for a long time, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. The image of Marcus in the lion's enclosure was seared into his memory, a haunting reminder of how close they had come to losing him. "I won't let him get away with this," David murmured, his voice barely audible. "I promise you, Marcus." In the quiet of their living room, David and Sarah sat together on the couch, their hands intertwined. Neither of them spoke for a long time, the events of the day playing over and over in their minds. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "What do we do now?" David exhaled deeply. "We fight. We make sure Robert is held accountable, and we make sure this never happens to anyone else." Sarah nodded, her expression resolute. "I'm with you." Together, they resolved to begin the fight for justice, fueled by the knowledge that their son had faced unimaginable danger and emerged braver than they could have ever imagined. The next morning, the Williams family woke to a household cloaked in quiet tension. The events of the previous day hung over them like a heavy cloud, and the realization of how close they had come to losing Marcus weighed on David and Sarah. David sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. His thoughts raced, replaying the image of Marcus teetering on the edge of the lion's enclosure before falling. The memory of Robert's smirk as he shoved Marcus was like a spark igniting a fire of anger inside him. "This can't go unpunished," David muttered, almost to himself. Sarah, standing at the counter, looked over at him. "It won't. We'll make sure of that." David nodded, his jaw tight. "We need to file a police report, and we need a lawyer, someone who can help us hold both Robert and the zoo accountable. This wasn't just negligence, it was deliberate." Sarah walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm. "We'll fight this together, David. We owe it to Marcus." Later that morning, the Williams family took the first step in their quest for justice. They met with a local attorney named Michael Green, a man known for his tenacity and expertise in cases involving public safety. Michael listened intently as David and Sarah recounted the events at the zoo, his expression growing graver with each detail. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. "This is an egregious case," Michael said, his tone measured but firm. "What Robert did wasn't just reckless, it was criminal. And the zoo bears responsibility for employing someone with such a dangerous history." Sarah leaned forward, her voice trembling. "Can we really hold them accountable? Can we make sure Robert pays for what he did?" Michael nodded. "Absolutely. The first step will be filing charges against Robert. We'll also open a case against the zoo for failing to protect its visitors and for allowing someone like him to remain employed despite clear red flags." David's fists clenched. What kind of punishment could he face? Depending on how the case unfolds, Robert could be charged with endangerment or even attempted assault, Michael explained. "The evidence, especially the eyewitness accounts and any security footage, will be critical." David exchanged a look with Sarah, a flicker of hope breaking through their frustration. "We'll do whatever it takes," David said. That same afternoon, the family filed an official police report detailing Robert's actions and the impact the incident had on Marcus and their family. The officers who took their statement were sympathetic, promising a thorough investigation. Meanwhile, Michael began building their case, starting with a review of the zoo's policies and Robert's employment history. It didn't take long for troubling details to emerge. "We've uncovered multiple complaints against Robert," Michael said during a follow-up meeting. There were reports of him behaving aggressively toward visitors and being dismissive of safety protocols. The zoo appears to have ignored these warnings. David's anger flared. They knew he was a problem, and they still let him work there? "It seems so," Michael replied. "We're digging deeper, but it's already clear that the zoo failed to act when it mattered most." As news of the incident spread, the Williams family found themselves at the center of a growing media storm. Local news outlets picked up the story first, broadcasting images of the lion enclosure and recounting the harrowing details of Marcus's fall. David and Sarah hesitated at first, unsure if they wanted to speak publicly about their experience, but after some thought, they agreed to share their story, hoping to shine a light on the dangers of negligence and to hold Robert and the zoo accountable. In an emotional interview, David recounted the moment he saw his son fall. "I thought I was going to lose him," he said, his voice breaking. "And it wasn't an accident. Someone deliberately put him in danger. No parent should ever have to experience that." The response was immediate. Viewers flooded social media with messages of support for the Williams family, expressing outrage over what had happened and demanding justice. The pressure on the zoo began to mount. Activists and advocacy groups called for an overhaul of the zoo's safety policies and better accountability for its employees. Protesters gathered outside the gates, holding signs that read, "Protect our children and justice for Marcus." Inside the zoo's offices, Rebecca Grant, the director, was feeling the heat. She issued a public apology, vowing to cooperate with the investigation and promising sweeping reforms. "We deeply regret what happened to Marcus Williams," Rebecca said in a televised statement. "We are committed to ensuring that nothing like this ever happens again." But for David and Sarah, words weren't enough. One evening, as the family sat in their living room, Sarah opened her laptop to read through the hundreds of messages they had received from strangers. "Listen to this one," she said. Her voice soft. "It's from a mom who says she was at the zoo that day. She writes, 'I saw what happened, and I just want you to know how brave Marcus was. Your family's strength is inspiring, and I'm standing with you all the way.'" David, sitting beside her, nodded slowly. "It's incredible how many people care, but it also shows how much work needs to be done. If Robert was able to get away with this for so long, who knows how many other families might be at risk." Sarah rested her head on his shoulder. "We'll make a difference, David. We have to." Michael's investigation continued to uncover damning evidence. Former employees of the zoo came forward, describing Robert's history of hostility and the management's repeated failure to address it. One ex-colleague revealed that Robert had been the subject of several internal complaints, but had faced little more than verbal warnings. It's a pattern of negligence, Michael explained during a strategy meeting, and it strengthens our case against the zoo. As the pieces fell into place, Michael prepared to file a formal lawsuit. The suit would accuse Robert of endangerment and reckless behavior while holding the zoo accountable for its role in enabling his actions. This isn't just about compensation, David said firmly during the meeting. It's about making sure no other family has to go through what we did. Michael nodded. And that's exactly what we're going to do. By the time the lawsuit was filed, the Williams family had become a symbol of resilience and determination. Their story had captured the hearts of people across the city, and the fight for justice had grown into a larger movement for accountability and change. However, for David and Sarah, the real victory would come when Marcus could finally feel safe again. The Williams family's story had become a rallying cry for justice and reform, spreading far beyond the boundaries of their city. Advocacy groups, parents, and activists began to unite around the case, calling for stronger safety measures in public spaces and more accountability for organizations like the zoo. David and Sarah were overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. Letters and emails flooded in, not only from neighbors and friends, but from strangers who had been moved by Marcus's bravery and the family's determination to seek justice. One letter in particular stood out to David. It came from a father in another state who had faced a similar situation when his child had been injured due to negligence at an amusement park. "You're not just fighting for your family," the letter read. "You're fighting for all of us who have ever felt powerless against institutions that fail to protect our children. Stay strong and know that we're with you every step of the way." David read the letter aloud to Sarah that evening, his voice thick with emotion. "Do you think we're making a difference?" he asked her quietly. Sarah reached for his hand, her eyes shining with both exhaustion and resolve. "I think we already have." The next step in their journey was to address the community directly. At the suggestion of their lawyer, Michael Green, David and Sarah organized a town hall meeting to discuss their experience and the broader issues of safety and accountability in public spaces. The meeting was held at a local community center, and the turnout exceeded all expectations. Parents, teachers, activists, and concerned citizens filled the room, their faces reflecting a mixture of anger and determination. When David stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. He looked out over the crowd, feeling the weight of their collective expectations. "My name is David Williams," he began, his voice steady despite the emotions bubbling beneath the surface. "And I'm here today as a father, one who came very close to losing his son because of someone else's reckless actions." He paused, glancing at Sarah and Marcus, who sat in the front row. Marcus was holding his mother's hand, his small face serious as he listened to his father speak. "Marcus is safe today, and for that I'm incredibly grateful," David continued. "But what happened to him should never have happened. It wasn't just an accident. It was the result of negligence. Negligence from a person who should have never been allowed to work in a place meant to bring joy and wonder to children." The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces a sea of nodding heads. "We're here because we need change," David said, his voice gaining strength. "We need institutions like zoos, parks, and schools to take their responsibilities seriously. We need to hold people accountable when they fail to protect the most vulnerable among us." The room erupted in applause, and Sarah felt tears well up in her eyes as she watched her husband speak with such passion. As the town hall continued, other speakers took the stage to share their stories. A mother recounted how her child had been injured at a playground with broken equipment. A teacher spoke about the need for stricter hiring practices to ensure that employees working with children were properly vetted. David and Sarah listened intently, realizing that their fight was part of a much larger issue. "Maybe we should partner with some of these groups," Sarah said to David during a break. "There's so much more we could do together." David nodded, the idea resonating with him. "You're right. This isn't just about our case anymore. It's about making a real difference." Over the next few weeks, the Williams family began working closely with advocacy organizations focused on public safety and workplace accountability. These groups helped amplify their story, organizing campaigns to demand stricter regulations for places like zoos and other family-oriented attractions. One campaign, called Safe Spaces for All, quickly gained traction on social media. It encouraged parents to share their own experiences and called for mandatory background checks and training for employees working in public venues. The hashtag Justice for Marcus began trending, bringing even more attention to the family's fight. Marcus, though too young to fully understand the scope of what was happening, noticed the change. He asked his parents one evening, "Why are so many people talking about me?" David knelt beside him, his hand resting on his shoulder. "Because you were brave, Marcus. You showed everyone that even when something scary happens, we can face it together and make things better." Marcus considered this for a moment before nodding. "So we're helping other kids too?" "That's right," Sarah said, smiling. "We're making sure other kids are safe." As the public's attention on the case grew, the zoo faced mounting pressure to act. Rebecca Grant, the zoo's director, issued another statement, this time announcing a series of reforms designed to address the concerns raised by the Williams family and the community. Among the changes were mandatory background checks for all employees, enhanced safety protocols at exhibits, and the creation of a visitor safety advisory board. "We know that words alone are not enough," Rebecca said during a press conference. "We are committed to rebuilding trust with our community and ensuring that our zoo is a place where families can feel safe and welcomed." The reforms were a step in the right direction, but for David and Sarah, they were only part of the solution. "Words are good," David said in a media interview. "Actions are better. And we'll keep fighting until we see real, lasting change." Despite the progress, the road ahead wasn't easy. Marcus began having nightmares about the incident, waking up in the middle of the night crying out for his parents. "I saw the lion again," he told David one night, his small voice trembling. But this time he was mad. David hugged him tightly, his heart breaking for his son. "It's okay, Marcus. The lion isn't mad at you. He knew you were brave, remember? And now you're safe." Sarah suggested they meet with a counselor to help Marcus process his emotions. The sessions proved helpful, giving Marcus a safe space to talk about his feelings and begin to heal. In the midst of their personal struggles, David and Sarah remained steadfast in their mission. They attended meetings, gave interviews, and worked tirelessly with Michael to prepare for the upcoming trial. Their efforts were bolstered by the strength of their community. People who had once been strangers were now allies, standing with them in solidarity and helping to drive meaningful change. As the trial date approached, David reflected on how far they had come. What had started as a nightmare had transformed into something bigger, a movement for justice, safety, and hope. "We've still got a fight ahead of us," David said to Sarah one evening, "but no matter what happens, I know we've already made a difference." Sarah squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with pride. "And we'll keep making a difference, David. Together." The day of the trial dawned crisp and clear. Yet the atmosphere in the Williams household was heavy with anticipation. David and Sarah dressed in silence, their movements deliberate and steady as they prepared for what they knew would be a pivotal moment in their fight for justice. In the living room, Marcus sat quietly on the couch, his usually vibrant energy subdued. He understood, in his own way, the importance of the day, even if the specifics eluded him. "Go back. Do I have to go too?" Marcus asked, looking up at his parents with wide eyes. David crouched beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "No, buddy. You'll stay with Aunt Lila today. Mom and I have to go to court to talk about what happened, but we'll come back as soon as we're done." "Are you going to tell them about the lion?" Marcus asked. David smiled faintly. "We're going to tell them everything. And we're going to make sure what happened to you never happens to anyone else." Marcus nodded solemnly. "Okay, Dad? Be brave." David's heart swelled at his son's words, and he hugged him tightly. "You too, Marcus. You're the bravest kid I know." At the courthouse, the air was charged with tension. The courtroom was packed with reporters, supporters, and curious onlookers eager to witness the proceedings. David and Sarah entered hand in hand, their expressions a mixture of determination and resolve. Across the aisle, Robert sat at the defense table, his face pale but otherwise unreadable. David's eyes locked onto him for a brief moment, and a surge of anger welled up inside him. This was the man who had put his son in unimaginable danger, the man who had robbed their family of a sense of safety and normalcy. But David took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about justice. The prosecutor began by laying out the facts of the case. She described how Robert had deliberately pushed Marcus into the lion enclosure, endangering the boy's life and causing untold trauma to the Williams family. Security footage was presented next, the grainy video showing the horrifying moment when Robert shoved Marcus over the barrier. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the footage played, the weight of the evidence undeniable. Witnesses were called to the stand, including zookeepers and bystanders who had been present that day. One by one, they recounted what they had seen: Robert's hostility, his actions, and the aftermath of Marcus's miraculous survival. "I saw him do it," one woman testified, her voice steady but emotional. "He pushed that little boy without hesitation. It was deliberate." When it was David's turn to take the stand, he spoke with a calm yet resolute tone. He described the fear that had gripped him as he watched his son fall, the helplessness he felt as Marcus faced the lion, and the relief that washed over him when his son was finally brought back to safety. "This wasn't just a reckless act," David said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "It was an act of malice. And it's something no family should ever have to endure." Robert's defense team tried to paint a different picture, suggesting that his actions were impulsive rather than malicious. They argued that he had been under stress and had not fully understood the consequences of his actions. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. The video footage, the eyewitness accounts, and his history of aggressive behavior all painted a damning portrait. The zoo's management also testified, acknowledging their failure to address the complaints against Robert and admitting that their hiring practices had been inadequate. Their testimony bolstered the Williams family's case, highlighting the systemic issues that had allowed Robert's actions to occur. As the trial entered its final stages, Michael Green delivered a powerful closing argument. "Marcus Williams is alive today because of his courage, the quick actions of zookeepers, and perhaps a stroke of luck," Michael said, his voice firm and commanding. "But no child should ever have to rely on luck to survive." Robert's actions were deliberate, and they were enabled by a system that failed to prioritize safety. This isn't just about holding one man accountable. It's about sending a message that this kind of negligence and malice will not be tolerated. The courtroom was silent as the jury deliberated, the weight of the case pressing down on everyone present. After what felt like an eternity, the jury returned with their verdict. On the charge of reckless endangerment, the foreperson said, "We find the defendant guilty." David exhaled sharply, his hands gripping the edge of the bench as relief flooded through him. Sarah reached for his hand, her grip tight as tears streamed down her face. The judge announced Robert's sentence: a combination of prison time and a lifetime ban from working in any capacity that involved public safety or family spaces. It wasn't just justice. It was a step toward ensuring that no one else would fall victim to his reckless behavior. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered to hear the outcome. When David and Sarah stepped outside, they were met with applause and cheers from supporters who had followed their journey. David addressed the crowd briefly, his voice filled with both gratitude and determination. "This is a victory, not just for my family, but for everyone who believes in accountability and safety," he said. "We're grateful for the support we've received, and we hope this case sends a clear message. We must do better to protect our children and our communities." The crowd erupted into applause, and David felt a sense of closure begin to settle over him. The fight wasn't over. There were still reforms to be implemented and policies to be enforced, but today they had taken a significant step forward. That evening, back at home, the Williams family shared a quiet dinner together. Marcus seemed lighter, his usual energy beginning to return as he recounted stories from his day with Aunt Lila. David and Sarah exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of how far they had come. They had faced fear, anger, and uncertainty, but they had emerged stronger, united by their love for their son and their unwavering commitment to justice. As Marcus finished his dessert, he looked up at his parents with a small smile. "Does this mean the lion's safe too?" he asked innocently. David chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. Yes, buddy, everyone's safe now, and for the first time in months, David truly believed it. The days following the trial brought a sense of relief that the Williams family hadn't felt in months. Justice had been served, and the ordeal that had once seemed insurmountable was now a chapter they could begin to close. Yet, life didn't immediately return to normal. Marcus still had moments of fear, waking up in the middle of the night from nightmares about the lion. David and Sarah continued to support him, attending counseling sessions as a family and making sure Marcus knew he was never alone. Each day he grew stronger, his confidence rebuilding piece by piece. One evening, while they were sitting on the couch together, Marcus turned to David with a curious expression. "Dad," he said softly, "do you think the lion remembers me?" David smiled, his heart warming at the question. "I think he does, Marcus. Lions are smart, and he saw how brave you were that day. I bet he won't forget." Marcus nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer. "Do you think we could go back to the zoo someday?" "Not right now, but maybe. When I'm older." David glanced at Sarah, who smiled gently and nodded. "Of course, buddy," David said. "When you're ready, we'll go back together, and we'll make new memories. Good ones." The opportunity to return came sooner than any of them had expected. A few weeks later, Rebecca Grant, the zoo's director, reached out with an invitation. "We'd like to invite your family back to the zoo as our honorary guests," Rebecca said during a phone call with David. "We understand if it feels too soon, but we want to show you the changes we've made and let Marcus see how much safer the zoo is now." David and Sarah discussed it carefully. They wanted to ensure Marcus felt comfortable and in control of the decision. "What do you think, Marcus?" Sarah asked. "Would you like to go back?" Marcus hesitated, his small hands fidgeting in his lap. "Will the lion be there?" "Yes," David said honestly. "But you'll be safe, I promise. And if you don't feel ready, that's okay too." Marcus thought for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Okay, I think I want to go." The zoo looked different when they arrived for their special visit. Not physically, most of the enclosures and exhibits were the same, but the atmosphere was lighter and more welcoming. The staff greeted the family warmly, their smiles genuine, as they led them on a private tour of the new safety measures. Rebecca personally escorted them through the park, pointing out the changes that had been implemented. Security cameras had been installed in every exhibit, employee training had been overhauled, and a visitor safety hotline was now prominently displayed throughout the park. "This isn't just about repairing trust with your family," Rebecca said. "It's about ensuring that no one else ever has to experience what you went through. We owe you that much." David nodded, appreciating the effort, though he knew that true change would take time, and continued vigilance. When they reached the lion enclosure, Marcus hesitated. The memory of falling into the enclosure, the feel of the dusty ground, and the sight of the massive lion approaching him were still vivid in his mind. "You don't have to go closer if you don't want to," Sarah said gently, kneeling beside him. "We can stay right here." Marcus shook his head. "I want to see him." Holding David's hand tightly, Marcus took a step forward until he was standing at the glass wall. There, lounging in the sun, was the lion. Its thick mane glowed golden in the sunlight, and its amber eyes seemed calm, almost serene. Marcus pressed his hand against the glass, his face serious as he gazed at the animal that had once been his greatest fear. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice so soft that only David, standing close by, could hear. The lion lifted its head, its gaze locking onto Marcus for a moment. Then, as if understanding, it let out a low, rumbling purr before resting its head back down. David felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched his son. This moment, though simple, felt monumental, a symbol of healing, courage, and the bond that Marcus had shared with the lion in that fleeting, unforgettable moment. After the visit, the family left the zoo feeling lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. For Marcus, the experience had brought a sense of closure. For David and Sarah, it reaffirmed their commitment to creating a world where children like Marcus could explore and dream without fear. In the months that followed, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Marcus returned to his usual routines, his laughter ringing through the house once more. David and Sarah continued to work with advocacy groups, sharing their story and pushing for broader reforms in public safety and workplace accountability. Their efforts didn't stop at the zoo. Inspired by their journey, they began speaking at community events and schools, spreading a message of resilience, bravery, and the importance of standing up for what's right. "We learned something powerful through this experience," David said during a talk at a local school. "That bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about facing your fear and moving forward, even when it feels impossible." Marcus taught us that, and will carry it with us always. One evening, as the family sat together in their backyard, Marcus looked up at the night sky, his eyes full of wonder. "Do you think the lion's looking at the stars too?" he asked, his voice thoughtful. David chuckled, wrapping an arm around his son. "Maybe he is. And maybe he's thinking about you, Marcus, the brave boy who faced him and showed him kindness." Marcus smiled, leaning against his father. "I think he was brave too." David nodded, his heart swelling with pride. "He was. And so are you." As the stars twinkled above them, the Williams family felt a quiet sense of peace. The journey they had taken was one of fear, courage, and ultimately healing. And while the scars of the past might never fully fade, they had found something even more enduring: a belief in the power of love, resilience, and the strength of the human spirit. The story of the Williams family is one that lingers in the heart long after it ends. It's a tale of unimaginable fear, extraordinary bravery, and the unyielding power of love and resilience. Through their journey, we saw a father's determination, a mother's unwavering support, and a young boy's courage in the face of danger. This family not only fought for justice, but also for the right of every child to explore the world without fear. What can we take away from their experience? At its core, this story reminds us that bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to stand strong, even when fear is overwhelming. Marcus's ability to face the lion, to connect with it in a way no one expected, teaches us that understanding and calmness can overcome even the most daunting challenges. David and Sarah's fight for accountability shows us that change often starts with those who refuse to be silent. This isn't just a story about a family, it's about all of us. It's a call to create safer, more compassionate spaces for our children and communities. It's a testament to the strength that lies in love, in unity, and in standing together against injustice. If you found this story moving, let us know. Comment 1 if you think it's a good story, or 2 if it deeply inspired you. And while you're at it, share your own experiences. We'd love to hear about the moments that shaped you or brought meaning to your life. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the inspiring stories we have coming up. Let us know your thoughts about this tale in the comments below. Thank you for being a part of this journey with us, and remember, bravery and love can conquer even the most fearsome challenges.